to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Hello, my darlings. Today I have 2 stories by E. Nesbit in a book that is called Grim Tales. And I'm bringing you 2 romantic stories out of it. Horror, but still romance. So spring is the time for such things. Anyway, the first is called John Carrington's Wedding. No one thought that May Forrester would marry John Carrington, but he thought differently, and things which John Carrington intended had a queer way of coming to pass. He asked her to marry him before he went up to Oxford. She laughed and refused him. He asked her again next time he came home. Again she laughed, tossed her dainty blonde head, and again refused. A third time he asked her. She said it was becoming a confirmed bad habit, and laughed at him more than ever. John was not the only man who wanted to marry her. She was the belle of our village coterie, and we were all in love with her, more or less. It was a sort of fashion, like heliotrope ties or Inverness capes. Therefore we were as much annoyed as surprised when John Carrington walked into our little local club — we held it in a loft over the Saddlers, I remember — and invited us all to his wedding. Your wedding? You don't mean it. Who's the happy fair? When is it to be? John Carrington filled his pipe and lit it before he replied. Then he said, "I'm sorry to deprive you fellows of your only joke, but Miss Forrester and I are to be married in September." You don't mean it. He's got the mitten again, and it's turned his head. No, I said, rising. I see it's true. Lend me a pistol, someone, or a first-class fare to the other end of nowhere. Carrington has bewitched the only pretty girl in our 20-mile radius. Was it mesmerism or a love potion, Jack? Neither, sir, but a gift you'll never have. Perseverance. And the best luck a man ever had in the world. There was something in his voice that silenced me, and all chafed on the other fellows failed to draw him further. The queer thing about it was when we congratulated Miss Forrester, she blushed and smiled and dimpled, for all the world as though she were in love with him, and had been in love with him all the time. Upon my word, I think she had. Women are strange creatures. We were all asked to the wedding in Brixham. Everyone who was anyone knew everybody else who was anyone. My sisters were, I truly believe, more interested in the trousseau than the bride herself. And I was to be the best man. The coming marriage was much canvassed afternoon tea tables and our little club over the Saddlers, and the question was always asked, does she care for him? I used to ask that question myself in the early days of their engagement, but after a certain evening in August, I never asked it again. I was coming home from the club through the churchyard. Our church is on a time-grown hill, and the turf about it is so thick and soft that one's footsteps are noiseless. I made no sound as I vaulted the low lichen wall and threaded my way between the tombstones. It was the same instant that I heard John Carrington's voice and saw her. May was sitting on a low, flat gravestone, her face turned towards the full splendor of the western sun. Its expression ended all at once, for evermore, my question of love for him. It was transfigured to a beauty I could not have believed possible, even to that beautiful little face. John lay at her feet, and it was his voice that broke the stillness of the golden August evening. My dear, I believe I should come back from the dead if you wanted me." I coughed at once to indicate my presence and passed on into the shadow, fully enlightened. The wedding was to be early in September. 2 days before, I had to run up to town or business. The train was late, of course, so we were on the Southeastern, and as I stood grumbling with my watch in my hand, whom should I see but John Carrington and May Forster? They were walking up and down the infrequent end of the platform, arm in arm, looking into each other's eyes, careless of the sympathetic interest of the porters. Of course, I knew better than to hesitate a moment before burying myself in the booking office, and it was not until the train drew up to the platform that I obtrusively passed the pair with my Gladstone and took the corner in the first-class smoking carriage. I did this with as good of an air of not seeing them as I could assume. I pride myself on my discretion, but if John were traveling alone, I wanted his company. I had it. "Hello, old man," came his cheery voice as he swung his bag into my carriage. "Here's luck. I was expecting a dull journey." "Where are you off to?" I asked, discretion still bidding me turn my eyes away, though I saw without looking that hers were red-rimmed. "To old Bambridge," he answered, shutting the door and leaning out for a last word with his sweetheart. "Oh, I wish you wouldn't go, John," she was saying in low, earnest voice. "I feel certain something will happen." "Do you think I should let anything happen to me? And the day after tomorrow, our wedding day?" "Don't go," she answered, with a pleading intensity which would have sent my Gladstone on the platform and me after it. But she wasn't speaking to me. John Carrington was made differently. He rarely changed his opinions and never his resolutions. He only stroked the little ungloved hands that lay on the carriage door. I trust May. The old boy's been awfully good to me, and now he's dying. I must go see him, but I shall come home in time for... The rest of the parting was lost in a whisper and in the rattling lurch of the startling train. "You're sure to come?" She spoke as the train moved. "Nothing shall keep me," he answered, and we steamed out. After he had seen the last of the little figure on the platform, he leaned back in his corner and kept silent for a minute. When he spoke, it was to explain to me that his godfather, whose heir he was, lay dying at Peasmarsh Place, some 50 miles away, and had sent for John, and John had felt bound to go. "I shall surely be back tomorrow," he said, "or if not the day after, in heaps of time. Thank heavens, one hasn't to get up in the middle of the night to get married nowadays. And suppose Mr. Bambridge dies?" "Alive or dead, I mean to be married on Thursday," John answered, lighting a cigar and unfolding the Times. At Peasmarsh Station, we said goodbye, and he got out, and I saw him ride off. I went on to London, where I stayed the night. When I got home the next afternoon, a very wet one, by the way, my sister greeted me with, "Where's Mr. Carrington?" "Goodness knows," I answered tersely. "Every man since Cain has resented that kind of question." "I thought you might have heard from him," she went on, "as you're to give him away tomorrow." "Isn't he back?" I asked, for I had confidently expected to find him at home. "No, Geoffrey." My sister Fanny always had a way of jumping to conclusions, especially such conclusions as were favorable to her fellow creatures. "He has not returned, and what is more, you may depend upon it, he won't. You mark my words, there'll be no wedding tomorrow." My sister Fanny has a power of annoying me, which no other human being possesses. "You mark my words," I retorted with asperity. "You'd better give up making such a thundering idiot of yourself. There'll be more wedding tomorrow than ever you'll have in the first part in." a prophecy which, by the way, came true. But though I could snarl confidently to my sister, I did not feel so comfortable when, late that night, I, standing on the doorstep of John's house, heard that he has not returned. I went home gloomily through the rain. Next morning brought a brilliant blue sky, gold sun, and all such softness of air and beauty of cloud as to make up a perfect day. I woke with a vague feeling of having gone to bed anxious and of being rather adverse to facing that anxiety in the light of full wakefulness. But with my shaving water came a note from John, which relieved my mind and sent me up to the Foresters with a light heart. May was in the garden. I saw her blue gown through the hollyhocks as the lodge gate swung to behind me. So I did not go up to the house, but turned aside down the turfed path. "He's written to you, too," she said without preliminary greeting, when I reached her side. "Yes, I'm to meet him at the station at 3 and come straight on to the church." Her face looked pale, but there was a brightness in her eyes, and a tender quiver about the mouth that spoke of renewed happiness. Mr. Bambridge begged him so to stay another night that he had not the heart to refuse, she went on. "He is so kind, but I wish he hadn't stayed." I was at the station at 2:30. I felt rather annoyed with John. It seemed sort of a slight to the beautiful girl who loved him that he should come as if it were out of breath, and with the dust of travel upon him to take her hand, which some of us would have given the best years of our life to take. But when the 3 o'clock train glided in and glided out again, having brought no passengers to our little station, I was more than annoyed. There was no other train for 35 minutes. I calculated that, with much hurry, we might just get to the church in time for the ceremony, but, oh, what a fool to miss that first train. What other man could have done it? That 35 minutes seemed a year, as I wandered around the station, reading the advertisements and the timetables and the company's bylaws, and getting more and more angry with John Carrington. This confidence in his own power of getting everything he wanted the minute he wanted it was leading him too far. I hated waiting. Everyone does, but I believe I hate it more than anyone else. The 3:35 was late, of course. I ground my pipe between my teeth and stamped with impatience as I watched the signals. Click! The signal went down. 5 minutes later, I flung myself into the carriage that had brought for John. "Drive to the church," I said, as someone shut the door. "Mr. Carrington hasn't come by this train." Anxiety now replaced anger. What had become of the man? Could he have been taken suddenly ill? I've never known him have a day's illness in his life. Even so, he might have telegraphed. Some awful accident must have happened to him. The thought that he had played her false never, no, not for a moment, entered my head. Yet something terrible had happened to him, and on me lay the task of telling his bride. I almost wished the carriage would upset and break my head so that someone else might tell her, not I, who, but for that, nothing to do with his story. It was 5 minutes to 4 as we drew up to the churchyard gate. A double row of eager onlookers lined the path from each gate to porch. I sprang from the carriage and passed between them. Our gardener had a good front place near the door. I stopped. "Are they waiting still, Biles?" I asked, simply to gain time, for of course I knew they were by the waiting crowd's attentive attitude. "Waiting, sir? No, sir. Why, it must be over by now." "Over? Then Mr. Carrington's come?" "To the minute, sir. Must have missed you somehow. And I say, sir," lowering his voice, "I never see Mr. John the least bit so afore, but my opinion is he's been drinking pretty free." His clothes were all dusty and his face was like a sheet. I tell you, I didn't like the look of him at all. And the folks inside are saying all sorts of things. You'll see, something's gone very wrong with Mr. John, and he's tried liquor. He looked like a ghost, and he went in with his eyes straight before him. But never look or a word for none of us. Him that was always such a gentleman. I'd never heard Biles make such a long speech. The crowd in the churchyard were talking in whispers and getting ready rice and slippers to throw at the bride and bridegroom. The ringers were ready, with their hands on the ropes, to ring out the merry peal as the bride and bridegroom should come out. A murmur from the church announced them. Out they came. Biles was right. John Carrington did not look himself. There was dust on his coat, and his hair was disarranged. He seemed to have been in some row, for there was a black mark above his eyebrow. He was deathly pale, but his pallor was not greater than that of the bride, who might have been carved in ivory. Dress, veil, orange blossoms, face and all. As they passed out, the ringers stopped. There were 6 of them, and then, on the ears expecting the gay wedding peal, came the slow tolling of the passing bell. A thrill of horror at so foolish a jest from the ringers passed through us all. But the ringers themselves dropped the rope and fled like rabbits out into the sunlight. The bride shuddered, and gray shadows came about her mouth. But the bridegroom led her down the path where the people still with handfuls of rice. But the handfuls were never thrown, and the wedding bells never rang. In vain the ringers were urged to remedy their mistake. They protested with many whispered expletives that they would see themselves further first. In a hush, the hush in the chamber of death, the bridal pair passed into their carriage, and its door slammed behind them. Then the tongues were loosed, a babble of anger, wonder, conjecture from the guests and spectators. "If I had seen his condition, sir," said old Forester to me as we drove off, "I would have stretched him on the floor of the church, sir. But by heavens I would, before I'd let him marry my daughter." Then he put his head out the window. "Drive like hell," he cried to the coachman. "Don't spare the horses." He was obeyed. We passed the bride's carriage. I forbore to look at it, and old Forester turned his head away and swore. We reached home before it. We stood in the hall doorway in the blazing afternoon sun, and in about half a minute we heard wheels crunching the gravel. When the carriage stopped in front of the steps, old Forester and I ran down. Great heavens! The carriage is empty, and yet— I had the door open in a minute, and this is what I saw. No sign of John Carrington and of May, his wife, only a huddled heap of white satin lying half on the floor of the carriage, half on the seat. "I drove straight here, sir," said the coachman, as the bride's father lifted her out, "and I'll swear no one got out of the carriage." We carried her into the house in her bridal dress and drew back her veil. I saw her face. Shall I ever forget it? White and drawn with agony and horror, bearing with such a look of terror as I have never seen since, except in dreams. And in her hair, her radiant blonde hair, I tell you, it was white like snow. As we stood, her father and I, half mad with horror and mystery of it, a boy came up the avenue, a telegraph boy. They brought the orange envelope to me. I tore it open. Mr. Carrington was thrown from the dog-cart on his way to the station at 1:30, killed on the spot. And he was meant to marry May Forester in our parish church at 3:30, in presence of half the parish. I shall be married, dead or alive. what had passed in that carriage on the homeward drive? No one knows. No one will ever know. Oh, May, oh, my dear. Before a week was over, they lay her beside her husband in our little churchyard on the time-covered hill. The churchyard where they had kept their love trysts. Thus was accomplished John Carrington's wedding. Uncle Abram's romance. No, my dear, Uncle Abram answered me. No, nothing romantic ever happened to me, unless... But no, that wasn't romantic either. To me, I being 18, romance was the world. My Uncle Abraham was old and lame. I followed the gaze of his faded eyes, and my own rested on the miniature that hung at his elbow's chair right hand, a portrait of a woman whose loveliness even the miniature painter's art had been powerless to disguise, a woman with large, lustrous eyes and perfect oval face. I rose to look at it. I had looked at it 100 times. Often enough in my baby days I had asked, "Who's that, Uncle?" Always received the same answer, "A lady who died a long time ago, my dear." I looked at the picture and asked, "Was she like this?" "Who?" Your romance." Uncle Abraham looked hard at me. "Yes," he said at last, "very, very like." I sat down on the floor by him. "Won't you tell me about her?" "There's nothing to tell. I think it was fancy, mostly, and folly, but it's the realest thing in my long life, my dear." A long pause. I kept silent. Hurry no man's cattle is a good motto, especially with old people. "I remember," he said, in the dreamy tone always promising so well to the ear that a story that delighteth. "I remember when I was a young man. I was very lonely indeed. I never had a sweetheart. I was always lame, my dear, from quite a boy, and the girls used to laugh at me." I sighed. Presently he went on, "And so I got into the way of mooning off myself in lonely places, and one of my favorite walks was up through our churchyard, which was set high on a hill in the middle of the marsh country. I liked that because I never met anyone there. It's all over, years ago, but I couldn't hear of a summer evening to hear a rustle and a whisper from the other side of the hedge, or maybe a kiss as I went by. Well, I used to go and sit all by myself in the churchyard, which was always sweet with time, and quite light on account of it being so high. Long after the marshes were dark, I used to watch the bats flitting in the red light, and wonder why God didn't make everyone's legs straight and strong, and wicked follies like that. But by the time the light was gone, I'd always worked it off, so to speak, and could go home quietly and say my prayers without any bitterness. Well, one hot night in August, when I had watched the sunset fade and the crescent moon grow golden, I was just stepping over the low stone wall of the churchyard when I heard a rustle behind me. I turned around, expecting it to be a rabbit or a bird. It was a woman. He looked at the portrait. So did I. "Yes," he said, "that was her very face." I was a bit scared and said something, I don't know what, and she laughed and said, did I think she was a ghost? And I answered back, and I stayed talking to her over the churchyard wall until it was quite dark, and the glowworms were out in the wet grass all along the way home. The next night I saw her again, and the next, always at twilight time, and if I passed any lovers leaning on the stiles in the marsh, it was nothing to me now. Again my uncle paused. "It was very long ago," he said slowly, "and I'm an old man, but I know what youth means, and happiness, though I was always lame, and the girls used to laugh at me. I don't know how long it went on. You don't measure time in dreams. But at last your grandfather said I looked as if I had one foot in the grave, and he would send me to stay with our kin at Bath and take the waters. I had to go. I could not tell my father why. I would rather had died than go. What was her name, Uncle? I asked. She never would tell me her name, and why should she? I had names enough in my heart to call her by. Marriage? My dear, even then I knew marriage was not for me, but I met her night after night, always in our churchyard where the yew trees were and the lichened gravestones. It was there we always met and always parted. The last time was the night before I went away. She was very sad and dearer than life itself, and she said, "If you come back before the new moon, I shall meet you here, just as usual. But if the new moon shines on this grave, and you are not here, you will never see me again any more." She laid her hand on the yellow lichened tomb against which we had been leaning. It was an old, weather-worn stone, and bore on it the inscription, Susanna Kingsworth, 1713. "I shall be here," I said. "I mean it," she said with deep and sudden seriousness. "It is no fancy. You will be here when the new moon shines." "I promise." And after a while we parted. I had been with my kinsfolk at Bath nearly a month. I was to go home on the next day when, turning over a case in the parlor, I came upon that miniature. I could not speak for a minute. At last I said, with dry tongue and heart beating to the tune of heaven and hell, "Who is this?" "That," said my aunt. "Oh, she was betrothed to one of our family many, many years ago, but she died before the wedding. They say she was a bit of a witch. A handsome one, wasn't she?" I looked again at the face, the lips, the eyes of my dear and lovely love, who I was to meet tomorrow night when the new moon shone on that tomb in our churchyard. "Did you say she was dead?" I asked, and I hardly knew my own voice. "Oh, years ago. Her name's on the back and her date." I took the portrait from its faded red velvet bed and read on the back, "Susanna Kingsworth, 1713. This was in 1813. My uncle stopped short. "What happened?" I asked breathlessly. "I believe I had a fit," my uncle answered slowly. "At any rate, I was very ill." "And you missed the new moon on the grave?" "I missed the new moon on the grave." "And you never saw her again?" "I never saw her again." "But, Uncle, do you believe? Can the dead? Was she? Did you?" Uncle took out his pipe and filled it. "It's a long time ago," he said. "A many, many years. An old man's tale, my dear, old man's tale. Don't you take any notice of them." He lighted the pipe, puffed silently a moment or two, and then added, "But I know what youth means, and happiness, though I was lame, and the girls used to laugh at me." So quoth this raven. Have a lovely day, my darlings. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.